In this 35th broadcast of TBR Radios, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, longtime professor of military history at the Army Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas, discusses various aspects of the Korean War and how it forever changed America's military policy, expanding the role of the president as commander-in-chief, enabling him to send American troops to wars that were never declared.
You know, the first year of war and maneuvers in Korea, how did that make the top 12 list?
Well, it's the first major undeclared war that we've had in our history. And people keep calling it the Korean conflict or Korean police action. No, it's the Korean War. Just because it wasn't declared doesn't mean it's not a war. What happened in the political strategic realm is it set the foundations for what we've done ever since. For example, Vietnam, not a declared war. People say, well, it's not Vietnam War, it's the Vietnam conflict. I tell them that's silliness. It's a war. Call it a war. Just because it wasn't declared doesn't mean it's not a war. And so it has set the way of doing business for our government since then. You know, the Persian Gulf War, undeclared. You know, the wars, OIF and OEF, undeclared wars. Korea was the first. And it kind of set the tone for what happened in the second half of the 20th century and now for the first part of the 21st century.
So when you have people like Senator Rand Paul, who, and his father before him when he was in Congress, Dr. Ron Paul, you know, perpetually reminding us that the Constitution says that Congress shall declare war. You know, as a military man, you know, you're obviously sworn to uphold the Constitution, but yet, you know, you're getting orders, you know, to go here, there, and wherever and do whatever it is you're being ordered to do, which, like you say, you can call it what you will. It's a war. You know, how did you reconcile that, and how do the men in command reconcile that now, or for that matter, how does even the rank-and-file soldier reconcile that?
It's tough because we've had people say, I'm not going because it's not a declared war. They end up getting court-martialed. Technically, they're right. You know, what business do we have just committing troops wherever the president's whim says? And so not declaring war causes all sorts of ethical and moral issues, you know, for soldiers, because you're sworn to uphold the law and follow the orders of those appointed over you, to include the President of the United States. That's in our oath of office, or our commissioning. So they put us between a rock and a hard place. We have to follow them, but at the same time, morally and ethically, it's not right if the American people, through the Congress, have not said we need to go here and fight. It causes a real problem. We have these discussions at the Army Staff College, we did have these discussions all the time.
So
there's been some really good articles written on it.
So do you remember the New family back in the 1990s?
Yes, absolutely.
And they were friends of mine. And Daniel New was at one time the president or the chairperson of the League of the South in Texas, a very, very strong advocate for Confederate heritage and monuments and so forth.
Yes.
But you know, he was the most high-profile case in that situation that I know of, but you probably know of hundreds, maybe thousands more.
I know dozens more like that, yeah. And there's probably more that I don't know about. Technically, he was absolutely right. We had no business wearing UN stuff and doing UN business. The UN is not a treaty organization. NATO is, but not the UN.
Right. And so wasn't that essentially the justification for the whole Korean war effort, was that it was basically a United Nations action?
Yes, exactly. Truman, and it was only by dint of luck, total fluke of luck. The Russians had walked out of the Security Council meeting, and when they called for the meeting to vote on action in Korea, had Russia been in the meeting where they were supposed to be and not boycotting it, then it would have been a U.S. coalition, but not a UN action in Korea, which would have made, I think, a world of difference, people getting involved. Well, of course, it was UN, which means we brought in dozens of other countries to get support, and many of them didn't supply a whole lot of anything. They sent, the Turks sent a brigade, the British sent a brigade, the Belgians sent a battalion. Not a whole lot, but Belgium's not a very big country. But at the same time, we were providing divisions worth of soldiers and equipment and stuff. It was essentially a U.S. war, and we had those guys just for window dressing, just to give it legitimacy as a UN action.
So I may be getting into a realm of conversation outside of what you plan to talk about today, but
I'll talk about anything you want.
Okay. Well, having read MacArthur's reminiscences, MacArthur goes on at length about Korea, and he talked about his defiance, which he makes no bones about, and he made no apologies for it. Basically, his resistance to and defiance to President Truman, and he basically said that his job was to uphold the Constitution of the United States and to protect his country from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and he definitely considered communism an enemy. And his job was not to entertain the whims of the temporary occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, who he actually comes within an inch of accusing of having been a traitor, that of course being President Truman. But yet Douglas MacArthur had to realize that he was essentially fighting an undeclared war, and he was fighting it with tremendous intensity. He never questions the legitimacy of his being there. But, obviously he would have had to have done that. And again, maybe I'm taking you into a realm of conversation, that's outside of whatever, but...
Yeah, there's an awful lot written on this, and we discussed this in our classes at the staff college. Where does your obligation to follow the president end? Can he tell you to do these things or not if it's not sanctioned by the Congress? And I don't think we've ever come to a clear answer on that. It's kind of like, you do what you got to do. And now it's easy to criticize MacArthur, but really, when you look back at the times we were facing with the threat of communism, a significant threat of communism, and they were eating up the world. China had just fallen in 1949, and that was a major event, for China to go communist. And it seemed like everywhere else in Vietnam, the French were fighting the communists. At the same time we were in Korea, they were carrying on a counterinsurgency against the communists. It just looked like everything in Asia was going communist. It was bad stuff. So from the perspective of MacArthur back then, not following the president's rules or laws probably made a lot of sense, because he was closer to what was going on than Truman in Washington. Now, the other thing is, a friend of mine wrote a great book that came out just a few years ago, called American Betrayal. And she writes in the book about the infiltration of the communists in our government. And Roosevelt had opened the door, and the floodgates opened for the communists to infiltrate. So the Senator, I'm having an Alzheimer's moment, and you'll know who it is. The one that had McCarthy.
McCarthy, yes, sir.
Senator McCarthy. Everyone badmouthed him for years. They trashed him. And there's a new book out just recently on McCarthy, and it vindicates him, because when they opened up the Soviet archives, when the Soviet Union fell, the archives were open for about 3 to 4 years before they slammed the door shut again. And Putin's the one that shut the door on it, because he didn't want the secrets getting out. They found out that a lot of these people that McCarthy had accused of being communists, they weren't communists. They were in the Soviet archives as being plants for the Soviets. So in the end, McCarthy was largely vindicated. But of course his name's been slimed, he's trashed, so he'll never get his reputation back, even though he was right. And what happened in Korea was influenced by the communists that had infiltrated the U.S. government.
what was the purpose? Because essentially Korea was a war, between the United States on one side and, the Chinese and the Russians on the other, with Korea just happening to be the battlefield. And so what was the advantage of putting the United States at war with Russia and China?
Well, there would be no advantage in real terms, although they were using the North Koreans as their proxy. But at the same time the Korean War was going on, we saw the threat in Europe, and we massively and very quickly downsized after World War II to almost nothing in Germany. And we rebuilt our forces in Germany because we honestly thought that Korea was a precursor to the Soviets coming across the East German border and attacking West Germany. We thought that was a very true possibility. So we quickly built our forces in Germany up. And by going to Korea, we were sending a message to the Chinese and the Russians, especially the Russians, that we weren't going to tolerate just leave them to do whatever they wanted. We were going to fight them, with whatever necessary power up to nuclear weapons. And Korea was the place we were going to do it, just to make the point.
So, as I understand it, the Kim family basically, can trace themselves back for, thousands of years. And, of course, the United States and some of the other countries in the Allied powers, they had another guy who they had set up, as the leader of, South Korea. And I can't remember his name, Moon or whatever, and he was like a Methodist pastor or something.
Sigmund Rhee.
And, why couldn't they have just and admittedly, I even think today that maybe some of the reasons why, the Kim family has maintained power for as long as they have in North Korea is, abysmal and as impoverished as life has been on the northern part of the peninsula. Is there something to be said for being the descendant of an imperial line that goes back thousands of years? And so it's very possible that the Korean people might have chosen Kim, early on in the 1950s, after the whole World War II dust's finally settled. But be that as it may, it's just a few hundred miles. It's a little peninsula. For example, it would be like fighting a major war to divide the eastern shore of, we call it Delmarva, little sliver of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia.
Yeah.
So why were they worried about this little peninsula south of China? Why not just let these people, live their lives and have their own governance and do their own thing? And what difference would it make to the rest of the world? Why did we even have to fight a Korean War to begin with?
Well, I think it was, excuse me, the fact that we had put we had wagered on the South Koreans and put our stamp there for a democratic government. We were, promoting democracy. So we were going to sell democracy to the Koreans. And the North Koreans, of course, went communist. As soon as the Soviets came in, they shot or executed all the democratic-leaning people and installed a Soviet puppet government who became the Kim regime. So I think it was, part of this post-war look that we weren't going to let the Soviets and do anything to push communism. And in 1948, when Churchill gave his, the Iron Curtain has descended on Europe speech, we took that as a challenge to contain the communists so they wouldn't go further. And that was our way of doing it, was to fight it out in Korea to prevent communism from spreading any further. I was going to say, because we were still occupying Japan, it was of concern to us that Japan might go communist. And we didn't want that.
Your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Well, Korea and Japan had been at war for years, and the Japanese, even before World War II, had exterminated, the Korean royal family, and
Oh, yeah.
And so the Koreans despised the Japanese, and if anything, World War II was their opportunity to gain their independence and their freedom from Japan, which, may have been one of the reasons why Kim was so well received. The people saw him at the end of World War II as the person who was liberating them from Japan.
Yes, and that's how they pushed it. He didn't do a whole lot to do it, but that's how they pushed it. I mean, the propaganda that he was their person on the white horse, so to speak. And you're absolutely right. And this is how the communists do things in different countries. They were saying, well, the U.S. has Syngman Rhee. He's a puppet. He's not really a Korean. He's just a puppet of the U.S. And so that's all the propaganda. But Kim was a puppet of the Soviets. But we wouldn't say that. It's whatever reason. But yeah, he had a lot of credibility as a Korean, saying, I'm going to reunite this country and make one great Korean country. But we had invested in South Korea to make it a democracy, and then, if we let them fall to communist aggression, what would that tell the rest of Europe, where they were having a major problem with communist insurgencies? At the same time this was going on, in the late 40s, Greece was fighting a major communist insurgency that we were helping them with. And so we didn't want to look like we were just going to walk away, that, we were no longer isolationists, we would help other people.
So I'm going to ask the silly but obvious question here. And, of course, we've all seen the television show MASH, which lasted far longer than the Korean War itself did. But
yeah. That's true.
Yeah, but MASH started as a protest to the Vietnam War, but they wouldn't.
Yep.
But they wouldn't stage it in the Vietnam War because that would be too obvious. So they made a show about the Korean War, and so if I'm guessing that, like myself, you've probably seen every episode of MASH at least 5 or 6 times.
Actually, I wasn't a big MASH person.
Okay.
And mainly because I thought it was so goofy.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask. So just how much like the actual Korean War was the television show?
Probably about 15%.
Okay.
The uniforms were right. The tents were right. The jeeps were right. But the haircuts, the way they acted, it's just out of character as how the military acted then. It, like you said, it's a reflection of Vietnam. I wish they had just come out and been honest and said, this is a portrayal of Vietnam as we want to see it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was so goofy, I just couldn't stand watching it. I'm sorry. it really made me mad.
So then, tell us kind of what the first year of Korea was like then, because obviously, all of us who, if our perception of the Korean War was MASH, obviously we've got it way wrong. Although there had to have been a Corporal Klinger in a dress somewhere, but
probably not in Korea. They might have been hiding him somewhere, but not there.
But tell us.
It's interesting because I'm involved with the Korean War Veterans Association here in Huntsville. And we do a lot of stuff with our Korean War vets. And, of course, my dad was a Korean War veteran, and so I talked to him for hours about that. It had a significant effect on him. He was in World War II as a sailor, and then left the Navy and joined the Army. He went to West Point and he graduated on the 6th of June, 1950. Well, the Korean War started on the 25th of June, so he got recalled from his leave. He was home on leave after he graduated from West Point, and he was recalled to his unit at Fort Benning, Georgia, to go join them and ship out to Korea. So I talked to my dad for hours about this. I had him write his reminiscences down, which I think one of the smartest things I've done, because he wrote pages. I helped edit it, and it's just fascinating because it was a microcosm of the Army. I found a bunch of his letters home from late 1950 to his mom and dad, and he was talking about how poorly prepared the military was, that the equipment was worn out. It was World War II gear. The Democrat administration, remember, Democrats ran the country from 1933 until 52 when Eisenhower got elected. So they cut, after World War II, to the bone, the military, and they went to this strategic view that we will use nuclear deterrence to stop the Soviets. We don't need a ground army. So the army was what we call hollow. It was awful. The units they had, even the few units that were left on duty after World War II, were at 2/3 strength, and that was on purpose because what they wanted to do is have a headquarters to stand up the unit to go to war, and what they would do is mobilize units and fill that 1/3 that was missing into the unit. So as an example, my dad was in the 3rd Infantry Division, which was at Fort Benning. Each division was supposed to have, on the table of organizations, 3 infantry regiments assigned to it. Well, all the divisions were the same. They only had 2 regiments. That meant they were lacking 1/3 of their ground strength was missing. And the idea was, if a war comes along, we'll mobilize reserves and stick them in there. Well, that doesn't work real well if you go to war fast. If you have time to train up, you might be able to do something. So the 3rd Infantry Division had to mobilize very quickly, and it was already under strength. They didn't have all the billets filled. So they were getting guys, my dad said they were getting guys out of the stockade that were in military prison, giving them a rifle and saying, we're going to war because we just don't have enough people. So the military was in terrible shape. The weapons were good weapons, but they were not maintained because they didn't have the money to spend on them. And so a lot of the weapons were worn out. I mean, you know, they wear and tear from constant use. They need to be maintained. No spare parts. And so the tanks we had, this is interesting. At the end of World War II, instead of bringing home all the equipment, because it would have cost billions of dollars to bring all the equipment home, they just left it in the Philippines in the jungle to rot. So they had to go to the Philippines to get tanks. They took the tanks to Japan, and this is what got Japan back on its feet after World War II. They took the tanks to Japan and had them fixed there. They rebuilt the tanks in Japan and then sent them to Korea, but they're World War II issue tanks. So we're fighting top-line Soviet stuff with our old worn-out stuff. It was a disaster. The first year was very mobile, but the first 2 months of the war, July and August, were very tenuous because when the North Koreans crossed the border, they came across with top-line Soviet tanks and aircraft, highly trained army that was very motivated, politically motivated, and they drove us all the way down to what they call the Pusan perimeter, which is a very small foothold on the toe of Korea. And it was only by MacArthur's genius of conducting the Incheon landing behind their lines that cut their supply lines, and the fact that our Air Force was hugely superior to the Koreans. We shot everything they put in the air out of the air very quickly and gained air superiority so that we could use our aircraft to interdict their supply lines. And they dried up on the vine, and we pushed the North Koreans north so that by November we were almost to the Chinese border. When the Chinese said, not so fast, we're going to stop you because we don't want you that close. And that's when the Chinese entered the war. That was a disaster.
So then, of course, MacArthur in his reminiscences basically says that he would have prevailed had he been allowed to pursue into China. And do you agree with that assessment, or do you believe that the war was pretty much over for the Americans at that point?
Of course, he's a much smarter man than I am.
Of course, MacArthur was also of the opinion that Chiang Kai-shek had an army that was, on the island of Taiwan and ready to come to the mainland and come to his assistance. And as I understand it, talking to men who were in the Navy at that time, that there was a naval blockade essentially around Taiwan that was intended to keep Chiang Kai-shek and his army from joining MacArthur's.
Well, there wasn't really a blockade, but the Chinese nationalists had no means to get to Korea other than walking up coast of China, which they no longer owned. So unless they wanted to hire us to be their taxis, they weren't going to get to Korea. And the problem, of course, the Chinese have is if they sent their army to Korea, then who's going to guard Taiwan from the communists from coming across and invading? So then you're saying the whole thing had basically reached a stalemate, basically. Yeah, I think trying to fight the communist Chinese hordes, unless we had decided to use nukes, was a losing proposition. They were being supplied by the Soviets, and the Chinese were providing. They called them volunteers. They weren't volunteers. I mean, there's no way these guys were volunteers. They were regular Chinese army troops. They just renamed their units volunteers so that they wouldn't provoke the U.S. into nuking them. But the Chinese were fighting against us. I mean, there's no question. I think MacArthur bit off more than he could chew. If we had gone into China, we would have really had a serious problem, unless we'd gone to nukes.
Extra, read all about it. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today. Extra, read all about it. So we had talked in a previous conversation, and I don't remember which month it was now. I think it was the month before last when we were talking about the raid on Hammelburg. And we had talked about the difference between, what is a calculated risk and what is a gamble. And I had asked you if you thought Inchon was a gamble, and you said no, it was a calculated risk. There were a lot of pieces to Inchon that had to be put together just so for that to work. And so kind of break that down for us.
Well, the problem with the tides was huge. The Navy knew that. I mean, they knew about the tidal surges there. And during the day, the tide goes out and ships are left literally sitting on the mud. That's how the tides vary, like 25 feet. It's not a small amount. So once the tide goes out, there's no way to get ships in for another 24 hours until the tide comes back in, or whatever the cycle was, 12 hours before tide starts coming back in. So the problem is timing was everything. Getting the ships in there during the high tide and being able to offload enough equipment to sustain the beachhead before the tide went back out, because until the tide came back, there was no way to re-equip or to supply your personnel that are on shore. So they had to do some tremendous planning. And I mean, the Navy and Marine planners did a phenomenal job. You have to plan how far you have to be, where the fleet has to be at every minute to get to the beach and surprise the North Koreans, because you don't want to sit there for 5 days shelling the beach. That just tells them, hey, here come the Americans. So they had to surprise them and get there with only a short amount of time before they actually launched the troops to the beach. So the timing had to be perfect. They had all these intricate tables to get the Navy at the right spot at the exact right time. So unlike Normandy, and even Normandy, they didn't want to throw the surprise off by parking offshore for 5 days and shelling. They only wanted to have a short bombardment so the Germans wouldn't be able to move their reserves. Same thing with the Koreans. We didn't want them to know, and we surprised the snot out of them. They were unable to react. And so, the genius of the thing is we're fighting in the southern part of Korea at the Pusan perimeter. That's the bulk of the North Korean army, and they have other troops in Korea. But in order to get to Pusan, they'd have to move while we had air superiority, which means we would have strafed every column they had, which we did. We did very successfully, or shot their trains up, and they would only be able to move at night during certain periods. And the other thing is, in order to march the North Korean army on foot, they were mainly a foot mobile army, if you got there and beat them to the draw, in order for them to march their reinforcements to Incheon, it would take several days, and we beat them, got on the beach, and built up our combat power before they could do it, and then cut off the North Korean army that was fighting on the Pusan perimeter. So they kind of evaporated. They just fell apart. It was genius.
And so, that far south in the peninsula, of course, South Korea was supposed to be the ally for whom, we were fighting to, establish democracy and maintain their government, etc., etc. But it was still essentially a Korean civil war, and so I would assume that you would have people who would be on either side of it, and the Americans and the British and the Australians and the Turks and so forth would be seen as the invader, and the North Koreans would not so much be seen as the invader. And so obviously the North Koreans are coming in, they're marching, they're advancing, they're fighting, they're the enemy. But what about the South Koreans? Were they cheering the North Koreans and doing everything they could to help them as they were marching further south? Or,
no, but they did have a lot of communist supporters in the South. That the North Koreans had slipped in during the year prior to the invasion. The North Koreans sent thousands of infiltrators down and political activists to try to get the South Koreans to become communist. But a lot of the South Koreans didn't want to have anything to do with the communists. They turned them in. The South Korean army got very good at tracking those guys down and killing them, because the Koreans could tell the difference. To us, they all looked the same. But
okay.
The South Koreans could tell who they were. Mm-hmm. But both sides were very, I'm trying to think of the right word. The communist North Koreans were hardcore communists. They had been propagandized, and the South Koreans were the same way. South Koreans had rounded up and shot thousands of pro-communist South Koreans. They didn't tolerate the North Korean or the communists in South Korea, so they rounded them up and executed them. No problem.
So, as far as the landscape and the weather and the geography and everything of Korea, of course, had talked about MASH before, and MASH was kind of filmed, I guess, in the mountains just north of Los Angeles there. It was kind of mountainous, a little desertous, a little forested, whatever. But was the geography of Korea the same as it was in the TV show, or was it totally different?
It was similar, and of course, MASH was filmed in California, but right. It was Korea is very mountainous, very hilly and mountainous. The whole East Coast are mountains all the way up to the sea, so it is very, very mountainous. And my father talked about the best weight reduction program he ever had was Korea, because he lost about 20, 30 pounds walking up and down hills every day. And I've got a picture of him when he came home in 1951, and his shirt has about 2 inches of slack in it because he lost so much weight. But the hills are awful. I mean, very, very steep hills. I mean, it's not rolling countryside. It's very steep. And so the mountains caused a tremendous problem fighting there, because without roads, how do you get your supplies in? And it was a tremendous problem, especially for the American Army, which was very road bound. The 2nd Infantry Division got cut off in North Korea in November 1950. Up north, the Chinese surrounded them and almost totally destroyed the division, because the division was on the roads. All their trucks and supplies and artillery were on the road. The Chinese were foot mobile. They marched up and down the hills, and they didn't depend on the roads for resupply. So they got in behind the American lines, which was a favorite tactic of both the North Koreans and the Chinese. Get in behind the American units, infiltrate, cut the roads off, and then, you know, the units would be in a severe problem because they're having to fight all directions. And the 2nd Division almost got wiped out. There's a great book by General S.L.A. Marshall called The River and the Gauntlet, and it's about the 2nd Division almost being totally wiped out in North Korea.
So what was the weather like there? As I understand it, and I could be totally wrong, you know, you had fierce, scorching summers, and you had, you know, intensely cold, heavy snow winters. And so you had an army that had to fight in both extremes. Yeah.
Well, when my dad landed in North Korea, they landed in Wonsan Harbor and then fought their way north towards Hamnung and then the Chosin Reservoir. That's the way his unit went. And they got there in November, late November, and he said it was brutally cold because the Siberian low comes down in there. And he said it was awful. And they had World War II uniforms designed for Europe, not for that kind of Siberian cold. So they had to quickly get new uniforms to the soldiers in Korea to keep them from freezing to death. He said that the Chinese did not have as good of uniforms, and the Chinese didn't care. I mean, a person is nothing to them. You know, it just did in their way of thinking. You know, you're just a number. He said thousands of them froze to death at night because they didn't have a way to stay warm. They didn't have good clothes, especially the first winter. But the U.S. had a real problem because we were using World War II designed temperate climate uniforms for Europe. And they had to redesign and get new clothing and new design stuff to the soldiers because it was so bad. He said he's never been that cold in his life. But again, the summers were brutally hot. And I can only say I was in South Korea. That's where I was stationed. Of course, we have no one in North Korea. And I can tell you, the summers are very humid and very hot. So it's kind of miserable, you know, trying to operate when you're sweating, and you wouldn't think it would be that humid, but I guess just because of the pattern, we're with the Yellow Sea right off the coast where I was, you know, the humidity was awful. And of course, in the spring, you have the monsoons, the heavy rains, and the rice paddies are full of water, and that just puts off more humidity. So summer times were very, very hot and humid, and winter times were very cold, and the wind would eat you alive.
You know, given the severity of the weather, and, you know, obviously, you know, with the monsoon time, you got a lot of mudslides, you got, you know, a lot of flooding, a lot of things that you have to deal with that, which limits mobility.
Yep.
You know, historically speaking, armies have, you know, not fought a lot in the winter. They spend a lot of time in camped, and then, you know, you've got the summer months, which you said were just absolutely, you know, horrible as well. So was the Korean War a war where you spent a lot more time in encampment and a lot less time, and very little time actually in the field? or did you just have back-to-back engagements in the worst of weather?
It was back to back. The Chinese didn't stop fighting in the wintertime. They kept going. And in fact, in January 1951, right after we pulled out of North Korea, when the Chinese entered the war, we evacuated Chosin Reservoir down to Hamnung, and then the Navy had to pull all the troops and thousands of Korean refugees out of Hamnung and took them down south of Pusan, and then the Army had to march back up the peninsula to go into combat to stop the Chinese, because the Chinese had pushed south and made a major move to do what the North Koreans had done in July. And so in January, General Ridgway takes command of 8th Army because General Walker dies in December in a Jeep accident. Ridgway takes command, and he was very aggressive. And he immediately had a major operation to retake Seoul from the Chinese who had captured it. So Seoul fell to the North Koreans in June 1950. The South Koreans and Americans recaptured it, and then the Chinese took it away from us again, and then we had to go back and recapture it another time. So it kept changing hands. And Ridgway had that major offensive to push the Chinese north of the Han River and recapture Seoul. And after about, I'm going to just give you a round time frame. After about June of 1951, the armies stopped the major maneuvers, and we dug in along what's now the demilitarized zone. That doesn't mean we didn't have movements, but it wasn't like the first year where there are these huge movements going hundreds of miles, seesaw, offensive actions and defensive actions. The first year was a battle or a war of maneuver, where both sides are moving large distances. But in June of 1951, we settled in about as far as we were going to move north on what is now the demilitarized zone today. And it became an action of, like World War I, trench warfare, trying to capture small pieces of terrain for political reasons.
So what made these particular pieces significant, other than the fact that they were just pieces?
Political. It was totally political.
So then it was whoever had the most pieces would win kind of thing, or?
Yeah, and because it was in mountainous terrain, you always wanted the high piece of terrain. You couldn't let the other guys sit on it, because when the fighting stopped, they could look down on you. And so you always go for the high ground. And there's always more high ground.
Right.
And in Korea, the object was, capture the hills so the other guy couldn't use them. And it became a political thing.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
In Vietnam, the objects seemed to be capture the hill, capture the hill, capture the hill. So did the terrain in Vietnam lend itself to that type of warfare, or was it just a holdover since Korea was a series of hill capturing, ergo now Vietnam's going to be a series of hill capturing?
Well, you're right in some respects there, because it depended on the commanders who were there. A lot of the commanders we had in Vietnam were young officers in World War II. And the measure of success was holding terrain, capturing and holding terrain. But in Vietnam, there were a lot of commanders that understood it wasn't the terrain that was important, it was the people. And you might have to have some of the terrain to facilitate keeping the people, but other than having the terrain, a lot of it had no worth, no value. I mean, you can't farm a lot of those mountains in Vietnam. There's nothing that can be done on them. And that's why the Vietnamese are largely, in the lowlands. That's where the farms are. So capturing them really didn't do a whole lot other than saying we're denying it from the bad guys. You didn't want them to have the ground because that's where they would stage their attacks from. So if you've seen the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young.
Yes, sir.
Okay. In the movie, they're attacking this mountain. The only reason they're attacking that mountain is because there's a North Vietnamese division that's there, and that's where they're stationed, that they're dug into the mountain. That's their base, that they go conduct attacks elsewhere in South Vietnam. That's the only worth of that terrain. You couldn't farm on it. The South Vietnamese didn't really want it. I mean, there's nothing you could do with it. But it became important just because the North Vietnamese were there. And some of our commanders, because of their experience in World War II, got into the mindset. My dad worked for one in Vietnam, and he was a fine person. He was really, and I'm not going to mention his name, but he was a very fine commander. But he had not gotten out of the World War II mindset that it was more important to have terrain than fight the enemy. And if the enemy was there, you fought him. But my dad said he was into what they called clearing grid squares. On the map, your map is divided up into what we call grid squares. Each grid is a kilometer. And so a square kilometer is a grid. And he was more interested in, did we clear that grid of all the communists today? Well, that's great. But a week from now, they're coming right back. They'll be in that little grid. So what good has it done? And my dad said he missed the focus of what he should have been doing. Now, he ended up getting medevac because he was in a serious helicopter crash, and they brought a new division commander in that was very, very good, that understood the terrain is a means to the end. You only want it if you can use it to kill the enemy. But we don't want to go out and clear grid squares. We want to find the enemy, and wherever he is, go kill him. So he understood how it was supposed to be done. And he was a very good commander.
So the Battle of Chosin Reservoir has come up a few times in the conversation. So just go ahead and tell us about that battle.
Well, it was the 1st Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division from the Army attacked north from Ham Nung or Hung Nam, and they were going north. And the Chosin Reservoir is a huge reservoir inland. It's surrounded by mountains. There's only a road that goes around it to the west and a road that goes around it to the east. The 7th Infantry Division units, the Army, went to the right, went east. And that became known as Task Force Faith, which was one of the units in the 7th Division. Then the 1st Marine Division went left. And the overall commander there was a guy named Almond, A-L-M-O-N-D. And the more I read about him, the less I like the guy. He was kind of a showboat, but he was a favorite of MacArthur. MacArthur really liked Almond. He was the 10th Corps commander at the time. And what he was trying to do is quickly, as fast as possible, get to the Yalu River. The Marine Division commander said, I don't like what we're seeing. We've captured a couple of Chinese. And Almond said, no, there's no Chinese here. Well, yes, there were. There was a huge, huge Chinese army hiding in the mountains that we had not seen. And the communist Chinese were very disciplined. They never moved during the day when the U.S. aircraft were out. So no one ever saw them. At night they would move, and they would hide at day. And so we didn't know the army, we were walking into a huge trap. Well, the Marines said, we smell something wrong here. And they were being very deliberate in their move up the Chosin Reservoir on the west side. And God bless them, they did the right thing. And they were putting units along their route of march in certain places to hold the key roads and places along the roads. Almond was trying to get them to go faster. He wanted to get to the Chosin or to the Yalu River by Christmas, and he didn't care about anything else. He wasn't paying attention to what was going on. And the Chinese struck and hit us hard. The Marines were in very desperate straits. That division was surrounded by something like 8 Chinese divisions, and they were going to cut him off, the 1st Marine Division, cut him off, and then take him, what we call, by piecemeal, destroy him in little pieces. The Marines didn't get cut off, though. They kept their road open, and when they retreated from Chosin Reservoir, they were able to do it in an orderly manner without getting cut off. The American units on the east side, though, had tremendous problem. There was a gorge they had to cross a bridge. The Chinese got behind their lines, blew the bridge up. Now, the amazing thing is, the only way they could get across that gorge is to have a bridge. They flew the bridge in. They had these mobile bridges that they could bring in. They weren't very mobile. On 8 cargo aircraft that they parachuted the parts of the bridge in and built this bridge under fire so they could get their units out. But they were largely surrounded and destroyed, the Army units. They just found some more remains a couple of years ago of soldiers that died there. But it was a huge, huge disaster for the Army units on the east side of the reservoir. It was awful. But the guy who actually dropped the bridges in there lives up here in Franklin, Tennessee. And I'm going to guess, I'm just guessing, he's probably about 98 years old now. His name's General Singlaw, and he was a younger officer then, and he was the only one certified to load and drop large cargoes like that. So he's the one that actually dropped that bridge, and he lives right up here in Franklin, Tennessee, right up the road from us. He wrote a really good book. He's the guy that was relieved by Jimmy Carter from his command in Korea because Jimmy Carter didn't like what he said.
So what was it about him that Jimmy Carter didn't like?
Well, this is a totally different story, but Jimmy Carter ran on the promise he was going to bring all the troops home from Korea during the presidential election. And then after he became president, Singlaw made a comment that if we bring the troops home from Korea, it will start a war. And President Carter, that didn't fit into his narrative, and Carter had him relieved and brought home. It was really ugly. It was in the newspapers in the time. I believe it was 1978 that it happened, and terminated his career. But this guy was an incredible soldier.
Well, it's my personal opinion that the Korean War would be over if it weren't for the United States. That North and South Korea would sign the treaties, that they would end the war, that they would possibly even reunify the peninsula. But that the reason that that's not happening is because our State Department believes that North Korea would get the better end of that deal, and of course they're not willing to allow that to happen. And maybe I'm totally wrong, but I really do believe that at any of a number of times, over the last 50 years, that the Koreans would have ended the war themselves had the United States not perpetually intervened. Even Trump's last summit with Kim, I believe the Koreas would have come together. Had Pompeo and Bolton and others not...
Yeah, I don't doubt that, but it would all be communist. The North Koreans have broken every single treaty they've put their signature on. Every one of them they've broken.
Right.
They are vicious, vicious, mean people. And the ends justify the means. One of the interesting things when I was in Korea in the winter of 1993-94, and I'm guessing it was in January. I don't remember exactly when, but it was wintertime. It was cold. The North Korean soldiers guarding the river line north of where we were put a trot line out because they were starving. The North Koreans are starving. They went out in their boat to check their trot line, and they got swept out to sea. South Koreans found them after a week, and they were just barely alive, took them to a hospital to treat them, and then they were going to turn them back and say, hey, you have a choice. You can stay here or go back home. The North Korean soldiers were 5'4" tall and about 103 pounds apiece. they were starving to death. That's their size because they're all starving in North Korea. And you can tell a North Korean next to a South Korean, if you look at the pictures, and I used to show these in my class because we talked about this, where they have the treaty village where we go to do the treaty talks with the North Koreans at Panmunjom. The South Korean guards are picked by the South Korean army. They pick the biggest guys they can find. They're huge, 6.5 feet tall, because the South Koreans have such a good diet today. A 6.5 foot tall Korean 80 years ago was impossible to find. Today you can find them because they have a very good diet. The North Korean guards are like a head and a half shorter. They can't get any big North Koreans. That's as big as they grow because they're so undernourished. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I've got some great pictures of the guards standing there with the South Korean guard towering over the North Korean.
So tell us about the Battle of Cheopyeong-ni.
Cheopyeong-ni, very famous battle. In the winter of 1951, the Chinese were pushing south again, and they surrounded one of our units at Cheopyeong-ni, and became a very famous battle because the army commander said, we're not going to pull them back. We'll let them get surrounded, and then we're going to go in and use that to fix the Chinese so they don't go anywhere, and then we'll defeat them or destroy them around Cheopyeong-ni. So the army unit that was designated to stay there was resupplied by air, and they were told, you're not coming out, you're going to stay right here and fight the Chinese. And so they were surrounded by these huge Chinese forces, and it turned into a major slaughter for the Chinese military because in order to make the Americans look bad, this was all part of the psychological operation. They were going to surround the Americans and then obliterate them by just overrunning them. And the Americans held fast, and it was a huge fight. The Americans had armor with them, and of course we had air power, but because it's wintertime, it was difficult to use the aircraft there. But the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division, which had been wiped out 6 months prior in North Korea, was the unit that stood and fought. So they had been rebuilt. So in February of 51, when the Chinese attacked, it was the same unit that had been obliterated up north. They had been reformed, and the commander, Colonel Freeman, told the troops, we're not going anywhere, we're staying here. And the 5th Cavalry, which was part of the 1st Division, was one of the units that relieved them and broke the siege. But when I was in Korea in 1994, getting ready to come home, the South Koreans were building a new highway right next to where the battle had occurred, and they dug up a huge burial trench with Chinese soldiers in it. And they estimated at the time there was 400 or more soldiers in the burial trench. And they notified the Chinese, said, hey, we found your soldiers. Do you want them back? The Chinese said, no, what are we going to do with them? I mean, that's, their view, they were just expendable. But they killed thousands of Chinese there. I have a friend of mine whose father was in that battle. And then I had a good friend of mine up at Fort Leavenworth. He unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago. He was a lieutenant in that unit. And it was an incredible fight because the Chinese mainly attacked at night.
When you were teaching your students about the Korean War and, particularly the conflicts that took place there at Chosin Reservoir and Cheopyeong-ni, what was your takeaway that you wanted the students to have?
I wanted them to know that the political ends have to be defined before you go to war. We got into Korea without really knowing what we were going to do except stave off defeat.
And that is all the time that we have for today's TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. I hope that you've enjoyed our conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, talking about various aspects of the Korean War. If you'll go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, you can find out about the Barnes Review. You can listen to back episodes of TBR Radio. If you just happen to be listening on YouTube, please click like and subscribe. We will be back in this same place again next week. Same time, same place, same bat time, same bat channel. Tune in again. Until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio, God bless. Talk to you again next week.